Hello, lovely readers. It's Tilly from Tilly Shelf, and I'm here with...
Ros from Scallydandling About The Books.
And Ros has come here to offer me an impossible challenge.
No, Ros has come here to see her lovely daughter, spend a lovely week walking in the Yorkshire Dales.
Yes, which we've done.
And while we were walking...
Film multiple booktube videos so far this morning that you'll be able to find on Ros's channel.
and Tilly's. But while we were doing our lovely, lovely walking in the Yorkshire Dales...
She decided to trouble me with very difficult questions. It's impossible to answer.
Because, and the person responsible for this is...
Difficult questions.
Is Brian of Bookish, who took a video made by Noah of Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse about perfect books. And gratuitously turned it into a tag and tagged me. It's an outrage. And then I troubled...
She decided to palm it off onto me to give me all the difficulty. No, we are sharing the difficulty.
We're sharing the challenge of trying to think, what on earth does a perfect book mean?
Yeah.
And just to make it a bit easier for ourselves, we cut it straight down and said, okay, we are only going to talk about novels. Because if you start,
just to make it manageable and approachable and relatively okay in a way.
And as we thought about novels that we thought could in some way be described as perfect, and even asked someone else about one of them, that kind of helped us work towards some sort of definition in our minds.
Yeah, so we wanted to have some kind of a framework, so we decided to talk about perfect books from certain genres, I suppose, mostly.
Novels of a particular type, and then...
Because I think you can have you're more likely to be able to find a perfect example of a genre as opposed to a perfect book as a whole, because it's got to fit so many different definitions.
So we started with the perfect crime novel, because it seemed like that was a more sort of defined one to choose.
Yeah. And for us, we were both pretty much in agreement that it should be an Agatha Christie.
Yes.
Because she is the quintessential writer of perfect crime books.
Yeah.
And I don't have the one that we chose. We're choosing between two, and one of them was The Murder of Rodger Ackroyd, which I have for book-waving purposes. But we eventually decided that it's not as good as And Then There Were None.
Yeah. Or not as good necessarily, but not as... Perfect.
Yeah. Because what And Then There Were None does well is it's got a lot of convincing characters. It really encapsulates that classic crime setup of a set of people trapped in a space with each other.
Yes.
It's got suspense that continues to be suspenseful. Even I've read it, I must have read it at least 5 times now, and I still enjoy it and feel the tension. Whereas I found on the reread, The Murder of Rodger Ackroyd was less convincing because the red herrings fell a bit flat.
Yeah. So that helped us start thinking about what a perfect novel might be, as it were. And then a really sort of another easy one in a way was to think about the perfect novel the perfect romantic novel. When this person wrote this novel, she didn't think, I'm writing a romantic novel, and it's not a novel that belongs in the romance novel genre, and yet it established that genre in effect.
Yeah, and that is...
And you must have guessed by now what that book is. Go on, have a guess right now.
It's Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, you guessed right. Yes. Well done.
Because, I mean, there is no romantic novel that could justifiably be held up as better than this in terms of the way that it delivers and the way that it sets up the archetype of what a romantic story should do.
Yeah, absolutely. And people, there's books that people think of as romantic novels, like say Wuthering Heights,
or Jane Eyre,
that are not.
Yeah, whereas this, it has a convincing kind of happily ever after, as well as Yeah. And it was while we were talking about this that we started to work towards our theory of a perfect book.
Yes.
And it needs a good beginning, basically. The perfect book needs a good beginning that grips you and gets you instantly engaged in the story. And what beginning is better than the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, which it starts with that really memorable opening line, but then it plunges into this really entertaining dialogue that sets up for the story. And likewise, And Then There Were None starts with this interesting question of why are all these people heading towards this island? And then the next thing that the perfect book needs is the thing that's second most important, I suppose, is a good ending. And I know there's been a lot of discussion recently around endings and good books with bad endings type thing. But yeah, it needs a convincing and satisfying ending that brings together themes that were introduced in the beginning. And then the third thing that it needs is a middle that carries those themes throughout the book and shows like character development and plot development. So basically our conclusion was that the perfect book needs a perfect beginning, a perfect middle and a perfect end.
Oh, really? Well, that was just really profound thinking. We needed another bar of chocolate.
We were on some, hillside.
It was probably starting to rain. There are. What I was going to say is that Pride and Prejudice is not my favourite Jane Austen novel.
As we've been talking about already this morning.
Indeed, and there's this very strong distinction in my mind between favourite and perfect.
Yeah.
Because, favourite can be flawed.
Yeah.
And yet, or aspire to something and not quite make it. Or there's all sorts of reasons why something could be not perfect. Yeah. Whereas this definitely perfect.
And it's got the other thing we were talking about, the perfect books have, where it hangs together very well in all of the details. Nothing is there coincidentally, and that's the same with And Then There Were None and some of the other ones that we're going to come up with as well.
Well, yes, because then we thought about the perfect fantasy novel.
Yes, and
so we asked an expert.
We asked my husband because he reads a lot of fantasy novels. He almost, not entirely, but he almost exclusively reads fantasy novels. So he's very, very familiar with how fantasy novels are set up and developed, and various fantasy series, I suppose. So we thought he'd be the perfect person to tell us what the perfect fantasy novel would be.
And the one he picked really surprised me.
Yeah, I did. Less so for me because I knew this was. I know this is one of his long-term favourite series, and that is the whole of his Dark Materials. So his argument is that it's not a.
It's not really 3 standalone books.
Yeah, it's if you could, you'd publish it as one big book. And that's the same for a lot of fantasy trilogies, I suppose. But his Dark Materials by Phillip Pullman. Yeah,
but it makes it's 3 volumes of one story.
Yeah.
And that's what he feels is and he had some very strong justifications for why it was the perfect fantasy novel.
And one of those is sort of originality, and I think that is something that he values above other things, is that the perfect book should be a very new idea. But on the other hand, if it's originality kind of moves it away from being the perfect book of a set type.
I think so.
I suppose.
Yeah.
So anyway, you were saying why were you surprised by this one?
Well, for that reason really, because I thought he would pick typical fantasy, and I think this is atypical.
This is definitely atypical fantasy. I sometimes forget that it would be classified as fantasy almost. It feels very distinct from the average fantasy book to me.
Yeah.
So we kind of respectfully disagreed after some discussion.
After asking an expert, we decided
to ignore their opinion. And we decided that, again, a set of 3 books that we'll count as one book, and that's The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, is the perfect fantasy story. So why did we decide that?
And we thought that it was perfect fantasy because, and this is part of our definition of perfect, I suppose, that every detail in it is fully worked out.
Yeah.
And so every character has a backstory which we may not know, but that Tolkien knew it.
Yeah.
That he could have written a book, a biography of every character, and the place that he could have written a history of every place that they live in or pass through.
There is a map of every town.
Yeah.
Every culture has, you know, like its music and things. It's all worked out.
The languages all exist.
Yeah. So
their future exists.
Yeah.
Their past exists. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so thorough. It really persuades you that
It's
the world
another-
exists outside of the book.
Another real
and
world.
I think
Yeah.
in terms of fantasy, where so much of it is about world building, that is what implies perfection.
So that will be why I'd pick that without again necessarily being favourite.
I also really like the character development that you get in The Lord of the Rings, and I personally really like the writing style, which
not everyone does.
Yeah, I know it's got some kind of little tangents and some bits where it kind of maybe goes on for a little bit too long, but to me the style it works.
And you could say it's not perfect because the female characters are weak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But compared to typical fantasy of the time,
Yeah.
he's probably done.
Yeah. And it's
relatively
you know
alright.
it's written by a man who was the kind of obsessive man who invented a language, and you know that, you know, I feel like you can't ask everything of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we went for that in the end.
We went
Our
for that.
perfect fantasy did.
So then we got thinking. Well, I said to Tilda, "What about a perfect historical novel?" You know, and she said there is only one answer to this question.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wonder what she's going to say. I wonder if it's the same thing that I was going to say. And miraculously,
It was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which we're counting as, although we've just been talking about trilogies that count as one book, this is part of a trilogy, but we are just counting the first book as the perfect one.
yes, I think so. I mean, in a way, I feel I think you could do the same thing. You could put all three together and call it one novel.
Yeah.
Or on this and Bring Up the Bodies almost is the perfect combination. But it just in itself, I think this is the perfect historical novel. And why?
Well, again, it's to do with that world building thing and the way that she really makes you believe in this period of Tudor England. Again, it's the character development thing and how he becomes this really engaging and important figure.
Yeah. I think where this sort of is more perfect to me than a lot of historical fiction, it meets the beginning, middle and end thing.
Yes, quite well. Yeah.
Really well.
Yeah. And the way as well, the added thing with historical fiction is how well it weaves in historical fact and whether or not the author succumbs too strongly to the temptation to bend history to their own means. And although not everything in here is literal historical fact, I never felt like she strayed too far from what we know.
She works very hard to avoid ever putting anything. She extrapolates and imagines, but she tries to never put anything in that's actually provably wrong.
Yeah, she doesn't change history for her story.
No.
She
No.
invents some things
She
that could have
assumes
historically
things,
happened.
and it, unlike some historical fiction, I'd say it has perfectly rounded characters.
Yeah.
I mean, Thomas Cromwell, you know, in this book is a miracle of writerly creation.
Yeah.
And
the
the dialogue,
prose as well is really good.
the dialogue really works.
Yeah.
And so in all the things that, and I never felt, you never capture it in terms of perfection.
Yeah.
You never capture out an anachronism in terms of language or practical detail, but also you never, there's never get your words out, Ros. Some historical fiction puts 20th or 21st century values, morals, ways of thinking,
true.
culture into the period that they're writing about, and she doesn't do that, and that I really admire.
Yeah.
Well,
because the temptation is to keep your own values and use your own values.
Yeah.
But that just doesn't quite work in certain historical periods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So perfect. Which brings us to...
And I just wanted to say, I was thinking while you were saying that, you mentioned the dialogue being really good, and I think that's another real feature of a perfect novel.
Yes.
And one of the things that makes Pride and Prejudice more perfect than Persuasion, for instance, is Persuasion doesn't really have very much dialogue. You kind of, when you read it, you realise a lot of the dialogue is described rather than spoken, and you can kind of think that they're having this conversation, but actually they're just kind of just telling you that they're having this conversation. Whereas Persuasion, Agatha Christie as well, she's really good with using dialogue to set up characters and set up situations. So yeah, I think dialogue is really important to the perfect book.
Yeah, I agree.
Managing dialogue, but not having too much of it, which is a temptation that some authors fall into.
Yeah. So we thought we needed to pick a perfect literary novel. Slightly, that's a
one that doesn't necessarily fit into a
that
genre.
isn't in a genre. It's just like fiction.
Perfect.
And perfect. And we debated this at some length, and there were, and Matilda said, "Oh, why aren't you going to pick Middlemarch?" And I said, "No," and we plumped with one that we were both happy
with.
To identify as perfect. But do you want to say?
Well, it was To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and I think we can both stand behind this and stand by it and say yes, To the Lighthouse is one of the perfect books.
Yeah.
Which is what you want. You don't want to have to feel like you have to defend your choice.
No.
Because I think many people who have read this would also see it as
perfect.
Yeah. And it's got
again not necessarily people's favourite.
Yeah.
Virginia Woolf, because that's not the question.
And again, it's got the beginning, middle, and ending thing because the ending is a very pleasing resolution to the story, but the middle is so innovative in the way that it does keep those themes going and keep the idea of the family going in a way that you just would not predict. Completely
so it's a different definition of
a good
a beginning, middle, and ending to the Pride and Prejudice. It's the sort of the non-linear version of a really good beginning. Character development is
also exceptional.
Dialogue,
great, and prose. Prose is just really stunning.
Prose, that's the
I guess
most perfect thing.
We were talking about originality earlier on,
Yeah.
and can a book that's really original be a perfect book of its type? But the way that her originality in this, likewise with Jane Austen, she was the starting point for, or she was part of the group that was starting a completely new style and approach.
Yeah.
So she set some precedents for the future.
And whereas in, say, The Waves, which I just read while we were in the Yorkshire Dales, not the thing to read when you've done
falling asleep.
You've done a long walk and then you eat something and you lie down and then
you get all cosy.
And
she was falling asleep all the time.
Even though I'd say, oh, just listen to this amazing sentence, read it out, and then fall asleep. But what I was going to say is that in a way she pushes it to another level in The Waves, in a really innovative, brave, and what I thought was wonderful way. But it's not perfect in the way To the Lighthouse is. It sort of loses something, and I might even like it better, but it's So this is where we're finding our way to our definition.
Yeah. I thought The Waves was one of her earlier books, but it's not. It's actually one of her later books. So she does kind of push it a step further than is maybe approachable to the average reader. Whereas I think anyone could read this and potentially not enjoy it, but get something from it.
Yeah. There we go. So that's our 5 perfect books.
Much
you
as
can
I
argue
resent having
with.
been
Made to make these possible choices.
So, let us know what you think about this, and let us know what your 5 perfect books would have been, or if there's any of the genres that we've selected. Would you argue for a different option? Do you agree with my husband, and would you put Phillip Pullman above?
And none of them are we saying that's the only perfect book in that genre. We're really interested in hearing other books that you might say were perfect.
And it's all taken with a pinch of salt, because this is what we think this week, and maybe in a couple of weeks' time we'd say, oh, actually this other book is.
I forgot this other book that's just as perfect.
Oh, the other thing that we didn't talk about any books in translation.
Yes, we deliberately excluded anything that we have read in translation, because I don't see how you can know
whether or not it was perfect.
If it's perfect in the original when you're reading a translation. So that kind of was one of our narrowing down.
So it was all English language, which is obviously limiting significantly, but it's just one of the rules that we had to set up to
be able to judge.
Have our precedents.
There we go. Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you very much for
letting me
watching.
come and do this.
And I'm not tagging anyone because I'm really bad at tags, and it kind of almost wasn't a tag to start out
only
with.
sort of a
It's a
tag.
discussion more than anything.
So if you've got something to add to the discussion, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
And let us know.
Thank you very much,
Bye.
Richard, and goodbye.